Thank you very much, Hans. And so welcome everybody. My name is Sam Thomas from the International Energy Agency, the IEA. And it's my pleasure to be doing this webinar with Richard and Jan from RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. Particularly pleased to be doing this through the DSM University. This is, I think, an integral institution in the energy efficiency field now. And of course, the DSM Technology Collaboration Programme is a vital part of the IEA's extended family, its energy technology network, which brings together policymakers, academics and industry representatives to discuss the most important issues in energy today. So why 3 speakers for the price of 1? Well, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of introduction, a bit of background to the work that we've been doing together. And the IEA has been working with RAP over the last few months on a project looking at market-based instruments for delivering energy efficiency. And this sprang from a request by G7 governments, so that's Canada, the US, Japan, France, Germany, Italy and the UK, at the 2016 Kitakyushu Energy Ministerial Meeting. And at that meeting, ministers asked the IEA to take forward work on market-based instruments for energy efficiency and to report back in 2017. So given that remit, we were delighted to be able to work with Jan and Richard and the RAP organization more broadly, given their expertise in the area. And we're very grateful to 2 members of the G7 in particular, to Germany and Japan for funding this work and also for their input to its direction. So far, in addition to desk research that's been undertaken over the last few months, we also held a workshop in Brussels last month at which we had speakers from Europe, the US, Asia and Latin America, and during which we discussed both the sort of strategic questions around the place of market-based instruments in the policy mix and some of the more detailed questions around policy design and monitoring, verification and evaluation. And the results of the work we've been doing and the workshop discussion will be released in a report at the end of March. So in the meantime, we've got this webinar and we'll be exploring some of the emerging themes. And the discussion today will be without prejudice to the conclusions that we may reach in the report itself. And indeed, we would welcome any feedback from participants that you may have during the webinar today. So without further ado, let's crack on to the content of the work. And we should start off by explaining what we mean by market-based instruments. And broadly, we mean that these are policy instruments, so programs or schemes that are delivered by market actors, so by companies or organizations that have a profit motive and often, although not always, are facing competition from rivals in the marketplace. And those market participants will be acting within a policy framework that specifies outcomes. Now, most often, and in the cases we've examined, these might be electricity or energy savings, but sometimes they're focused on one of the wider multiple benefits that energy efficiency can deliver. And I've listed a few of those on the slide there. And those outcomes, while being specified, what defines these market-based instruments is that the delivery mechanism and the measures that can be used to meet that specified outcome are not prescribed. So what sort of distinguishes these instruments from other more standard policies is the combination of A, private sector competition, and B, the freedom within a clearly defined set of rules for those private sector actors to deliver in the way that is most beneficial to them. So next, let's take that broad definition and narrow down to the instruments that we focused on in this work. We have, of course, looked at market-based instruments that focus on the delivery of energy efficiency outcomes, and we divide those into 2 broad groups. So firstly, energy efficiency obligations, also known as energy savings obligations, energy efficiency resource standards, energy efficiency performance standards, white certificate programs. I could go on. In these programs, essentially a part of the energy supply chain is obligated to deliver energy efficiency outcomes, and they're free to deliver on that obligation in whichever way they choose within the rules of the scheme. And in some cases, most clearly with white certificates, they can trade compliance with either with other obligated parties or in some cases with third parties elsewhere in the energy efficiency supply chain. The other broad group is auction mechanisms, and here we see market actors are able to put forward bids, either in competitive tenders where the lowest bids win, or within a framework that sets the price per unit of energy savings, and market actors are invited to bring proposals forward to deliver savings at that price. In addition to those energy efficiency auctions, we've also examined capacity auctions in the United States. There's a couple in particular where energy efficiency can compete with other resources to fulfill electricity system adequacy requirements. Now, while these are not exclusively designed to deliver on energy efficiency, we chose to examine capacity auctions given policymakers' interests in their potential to drive action on efficiency, and Richard will delve into this in more detail later. Now, one could look at the differences between market-based instruments in at least two dimensions. Where the different instruments appear on this grid will depend on both policymakers' objectives and market structure. Amongst obligation programs, the common characteristic is that as long as targets are met, the savings are predetermined. So essentially we're talking about quantity-based energy efficiency programs, and they tend to be funded through ratepayer or bill payer contributions. But the mechanism for passing through costs to ratepayers of funding those programs, that varies. So in most vertically integrated markets, for example, many in the US, in Brazil and China, this is predetermined by the regulator on the basis of evaluation evidence and ex-ante appraisal, with profits or losses accruing to the obligated party. On the other hand, in competitive markets, for example, most of them in Europe, for example, the amount passed through is more often not predetermined, with, at least in theory, obligated parties incentivized to pass on the marginal costs of meeting the obligation to their customers. On the auction side, dedicated efficiency auctions tend to be funded by either levies or customer bills, levies on customer bills or out of general taxation. Maximum funding levels tend to be prescribed, although they're not always spent, while the amount of savings varies. Capacity auctions, on the other hand, prescribe neither the price nor the savings associated with efficiency per se, given that they allow non-efficiency resources to bid into the system as well. So you can see on this slide that we have a way, I guess a conceptual way, of splitting up some of the market-based instruments that we're talking about. So where can these instruments be found? Well, they have spread to 6 continents around the world in 23 different countries. Obligations tend to dominate. There's 24 alone in the US in various states, 12 in the EU, 4 in Australia, and a further 6 across other countries, including South Africa, Brazil, Uruguay, and China. Auctions are comparatively rare. We see 4 in Europe focused solely on energy efficiency, and 2 in the US focused on capacity, where energy efficiency is competing against those other resources. There is, however, interest from a number of countries in developing both auctions and new obligations. So what's driving this interest in market-based instruments? Well, there's a number of reasons. So to some extent, at least in Europe, this has been forced upon countries. So the Energy Efficiency Directive of 2012 promoted energy efficiency obligations as a means of delivering savings towards countries' policy savings targets. So the role of the European Commission and European institutions more generally has been key in Europe, and it's driven countries to look at both obligation programs and alternative measures such as auctions in order to deliver energy efficiency savings. At the same time, there has been a long-standing desire to see energy utilities change their business models from selling energy to selling energy services, and obligations can be seen as a potential driver of this change, and certainly was one of the key drivers in the setting up of the French energy efficiency obligation. But more generally, I think it's the characteristics of these market-based instruments that are attractive to at least some policymakers. Many governments, although by no means all, have bought the idea that we need more energy efficiency action to deliver on our societal goals, whether they're around carbon, around fuel poverty, or around the costs of delivering a secure and adequate electricity system. But at the same time, budgets are tight and value for money concerns are paramount for policymakers. And these types of instruments offer the likelihood that through market forces and the flexibility given to participants to deliver solutions that are cheapest to them, cost-effective energy efficiency outcomes can be delivered for society more generally. Of course, it is this very flexibility that can also be worrying for policymakers. What if obligated parties or auction winners discover innovative new ways of meeting their contractual obligations that we hadn't anticipated, and actually we don't very much like? So, for example, what if hundreds of millions of light bulbs get distributed and we don't think that they're going to deliver the savings we wanted, or indeed the right mix of measures? Well, that might be an extreme example, but it is true that in return for the benefits of these types of instruments, the reduced costs, the delivery route neutrality that allows the most cost-effective measures to be discovered, one has, as a policymaker, to bear some risk that you haven't been able to fully articulate your objectives in the rules within which the participants are engaging. But the good news is, however, that there is now a lot of evidence from existing programs that can help policymakers to improve the design of existing policies, and in countries that have yet to implement a market-based instrument, to design the right policy framework for their context. And so that puts a premium on both evaluation evidence and international cooperation in order for countries to identify the right policy framework for them. And with that, I will hand over to Jan, who will take us through some of that evidence that we've been gathering during this project. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for setting the scene for this webinar very nicely. If you can hear some rattling in the background, that's a storm. I'm in Oxford and there's a storm today, so I apologize for any noise that you may hear. I will now share some of the findings from our work with the IEA on MBIs. And I will start by first presenting some high-level data on the market-based instruments that we identified before I go into some of the lessons learned that come out of the analysis, and then hand over to Richard to continue that list of lessons learned and to look at some of the case studies in much more detail. So on my first slide, I show you the high-level data on the amount of public investment that is channeled through market-based instruments in energy efficiency. And by public investment, we mean the amount of money paid for by the public, and that's typically paid through taxes or energy bills. And it's important to understand that this data does not include any private contributions made by those participants of the program who benefit from the energy efficiency measures themselves. So it's just the public component of the investment. And I'll show you some slides on the private investment in a minute. So we can see that the public investment has risen quite dramatically from 2005, when it was around $2 billion per year, to now around $12 billion per year, which means that it has increased by a factor of 6, which is a significant increase. And when we look at the breakdown of where this money is being spent, we can see that about half of the investment is assigned to the US in this chart. And this is because almost half of all the MBIs, market-based instruments, are located in the US. And the US also has the longest history of market-based instruments. So they had a long time to develop their programs and increase the amount of investment and the energy efficiency savings that are being delivered. The second largest share on this chart is located in Europe. It's broken down by several countries, and this is driven mainly by the Energy Efficiency Directive, which encourages member states to implement energy efficiency obligations, and Richard will speak about this later in a bit more detail. But this is the main driver in Europe for having quite a large number of market-based instruments and corresponding investment. But it's also important to note that the share of market-based instruments in the rest of the world is growing, and we would expect it to grow further in the coming years. There's quite a few countries, as Sam said in the introduction, that are now planning to implement market-based instruments, and it remains to be seen how successful they will be, but I would expect that in 5 years' time we would see a larger share of investment from countries that are not in the US or in Europe. So this slide showed you the public investment. On my next slide, I can show you some figures on the amount of private investment that's being channeled through market-based instruments. Data on private investment is usually much more difficult to come by because it's not recorded in the same way. But where we have data, we can see that it's about 0.5 to 2 times the amount of public investment. So in other words, for $1 US that is spent by the public, we get another $0.50 to $2 back in terms of private investment. And there are uncertainties around this data. Best data that we have is from the US. So if we apply that sort of ratio to the amount of public investment, remember the slide I've just shown you before, it was about $12 billion per year, we can derive an estimate of the total investment of around 20 to 35 billion US dollars per year, which is roughly 10 to 15% of the total global energy efficiency investment, if we use the latest data from the IEA's Energy Efficiency Market Report. So a significant chunk of total global investment is already being delivered through these market-based instruments. A question that we always get asked when we present data on the amount of investment is this really cost effective? And on my next slide, I will answer this specific question on cost effectiveness. So here we see a range of different programs from across the world, and we see the amount of money spent on 1 unit of energy savings. So the unit that we're looking at is US dollars per kilowatt hour saved over the lifetime of the measures being installed. And there's 2 things I want to point out on this slide. And the first one is that the weighted average that you can see on this slide, which is the blue dotted line, is around 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour. This is just the cost of the public. It does not include the private investment. If we add the private investment, even if we add the private investment, we can still see that the cost is significantly less than the cost of supplied energy in most sectors. So that's the first learning, that there's a lot of data, it varies, but on average, it indicates that it's pretty cost effective. The second learning that I want you to take away from this slide is that there's huge variation between the different schemes. And there are at least 2 reasons for the variation that we can identify. The first one is that the methods and the rigor applied to evaluating and monitoring those kinds of schemes is quite different across the world. So for example, if you do not include free riders from the estimates of the impact, then that would obviously make the cost effectiveness figures look much better. If you assume very long lifetimes that are unrealistic, that has a similar impact. So you can, depending on your methodology, overestimate or underestimate the cost. So that's the first reason. And we can see that in those countries where there's very strict and robust evaluation procedures, for example in the US, we see higher costs per kilowatt hour saved on the chart. The second reason is related to design. So there are many different options how you set up those programs, and Sam has touched on some of those issues. So you might want to focus on more costly technologies or on low-income households, for example. And that will, by definition, increase the cost per unit of energy saved. The UK on this chart would be a very good example. It has relatively high cost. The main reason for that is that it's focusing primarily on low-income households. So there, just two reasons for why there may be differences between the different schemes that we have analyzed. And on my next slide, I just show you a few of the design features that have an impact on the cost structure of those different types of schemes. I don't go into every one of them, and we will produce a report later on in the year that will discuss all of those issues in much more detail. I just wanted to show you the variety of different elements that make an MBI, and obviously no MBI is the same. Every MBI has a slightly different design and uses slightly different features in different combinations. So I just wanted to point out that there are different elements that make the instrument, rather than just say every auction is the same or every energy efficiency obligation is the same. We now go into some of the design features in more detail, and I present some lessons learned, what we found when we did the analysis. So we start with the first lesson that we've drawn from looking at the different schemes, and that first lesson is that you should start small and grow big to allow for policy learning, and then you can ramp up the scheme later on. And why is that? Well, it allows for testing the initial design, refining it, and then learning how to do things more effectively. So that's kind of the perspective from the policymaker. From the perspective of the supply chain, having a scheme that starts small and grows big gives the supply chain the opportunity to develop and grow over time. So it allows for the industry to grow at a pace that is appropriate. And as there's one example that I have put on this slide where this principle has been applied. This is an example from the UK, where an energy efficiency obligation scheme has been in place since the early 90s, 1994. And you can see the targets here expressed in million tons of CO2 have increased over time from the first programs in the early 90s on the left-hand side of the chart to the last program, the third program that ended in 2012, the right-hand side of the chart. So the targets have gone up continuously, but started at quite a low level and reached very high levels at the end. So this is one example of how this can be done. The second lesson is that very good programs can deliver up to 2% of savings per year, savings of obligated fuels, that is. And the most successful market-based instruments do not just deliver those savings in 1 year, but they can deliver this over many years in a row. And here are just some examples. So for example, in Arizona, there's a scheme, an energy efficiency obligation that has been running for some time, and it's supposed to deliver 2% annually over 20% in 10 years. So it's a significant amount of energy savings that's being delivered year by year. Australia, in New South Wales, it's 34% reduction in 11 years. And the Energy Efficiency Directive in Europe stipulates that member states have to save 1.5% annually, which could amount up to 26% by 2030. They don't have to use market-based instruments for that, but many of them do. What we also know is that programs that deliver such savings to about 2% per year typically spend around 3 to 5% of system revenues. Those are not trivial amounts, but compared to the savings, they are well justified, given that the savings persist for many years and the investment is only made in the first year. So lesson number 3 that we've learned is that it's important to focus also on the longer lived measures. And by longer lived measures, we mean measures that have longer lifetimes. For example, building insulation will be a classical one, opposed to measures that just have very short lifetimes. So Sam talked about the example with the light bulb. That typical measure with a very short lifetime. And we found that successful MBIs deliver not just short-lived measures, but also longer-lived measures. And there are at least 3 options of how you can achieve that. So one is that you use lifetime savings as a metric when you calculate the savings target or the savings that you have achieved and when you reward savings. The other one is that you provide an incentive for measures with longer lifetimes. So for example, you could provide a 50% bonus if you deliver a measure that has a long lifetime. You could also have a minimum quota for longer-lived measures or a maximum quota for shorter-lived measures. And we have found examples where this has been put into place successfully. So there are a range of different approaches, and I just selected one snapshot from the forthcoming work, which shows the range of different metrics used across the different instruments. So there's a lot of variation there, and it really depends on the aims of the program But focusing on longer lift measures makes a good MBI in our view. My fourth lesson that I would like to point out is that it's really important to build a robust evaluation, monitoring, and verification systems, because then you have a system that allows you to continuously evaluate and improve the scheme that you're running. This is often forgotten, but it really matters. And I know that there have been lots of webinars in the past run by the IEA, DSN University, that focus on this particular point, so I'm not going into any detail. But we found that the good systems, the good market-based instruments, have very strong EM&V systems in place because they're key to effective program design. So not only do we get better quality estimates of the program's impact, but we can also use the system to identify flaws and make sure the program is working effectively. I won't go into the graph that I put in here, but it just shows the different factors that a good system would need to take into account in order to reflect how the system is operating and to make sure that the results that are being calculated are accurate. I will now hand over to Richard to continue the list of lessons learned, but he will draw more concretely on very specific MBIs and his experience working in the US on efficiency obligation schemes and capacity markets. So over to you, Richard.
All right, thank you, Jan. Continuing with the lessons that we've learned in doing this work over the years and also in conducting this research with the IEA, I'll start with a question that we're often asked. We're often asked whether energy efficiency obligations or MBIs work better in systems that are vertically integrated under traditional regulation or are in competitive retail environments. And the truth is, when we look at the data, there are strong programs in both kinds of systems and in even hybrid systems where there's wholesale competition but retail monopoly service. We're also asked whether there's some received wisdom on whether the obligation in an EEO should be placed on retailers or sellers of energy, or whether they ought to be placed on distribution. And again, we find that there are a lot of successful models out there, some of them tailored exactly to circumstances in individual jurisdictions. And the research supports the conclusion that each jurisdiction has the opportunity to decide for itself how it wishes to place the obligation. In the United States, as Jan mentioned earlier, there has been very significant growth in spending on programmatic energy efficiency in the utility sector. This chart shows you spending, the path of spending in the U.S. over the past couple of decades, rising now to at least $7.7 billion on the programmatic side. So why is this happening in a country that is famously averse to higher taxes? It's happening because the conclusion in state after state across the country is that these programs are effective and cost effective, and they're willing, regulators and legislators are willing to ensure that they're funded. In Europe, we've had a similar evolution, really, with the implementation of Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. The European high-level goal is for a liberalized energy market, and it does not have, those systems don't have a tradition of integrated resource planning as in the US. And here we see that current data are that energy efficiency obligations in Europe provide more than a third of the savings that are required across the entire economy under the Energy Efficiency Directive. Here again in Europe, the lessons are the same. Sometimes the obligations are on retailers, sometimes they're on distributors, sometimes the member states have chosen to use alternative means to deliver efficiency. But there are a variety of successful approaches in Europe as there are in the US and Australia. Now back to lessons. I'm not going to go through the details on this chart because I suspect people in the energy efficiency world know very well the market barriers to efficiency in the entirely unconstrained market. But the key lesson that I would like to remind people of is energy efficiency obligations, unlike some other aspects of the clean energy transition, such as renewable feed-in tariffs, require end-use customers to do something. Millions upon millions of end-use customers need to choose to install efficiency solutions. And it's essential from the very beginning to design a program that works for consumers. They need trusted information, they need financial help, and we've learned the hard way that simply creating a low-interest loan program or a green fund, as in the Green Deal in the UK, is just not adequate to deliver the full array of services that customers need in order to install efficiency devices. On the positive side, we've learned that the multiple benefits of efficiency are much larger than we thought. When I was a regulator and began in this business about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I guess, the assumption was that the benefits of energy efficiency were largely in the avoided energy cost. And on this bar, that's the bottom blue portion of the bar. And we only learned later, after delivering significant amounts of energy efficiency, that there are a number of other savings. Power systems, and it's true for natural gas systems as well. And that one very careful study done in Vermont in 2010 concluded that the savings from a kilowatt hour of energy efficiency were about 14 cents per kilowatt hour. We've since learned in other studies that if you count environmental benefits and health benefits, that the total savings are often closer to 20 or 22 cents per kilowatt. Jan showed you data showing that the cost of saved energy across most of these systems is anywhere between 1 cent and 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then, as you can see, the ratios of benefits to costs are very strongly weighted to the benefits side. One little-known result of this in the United States was revealed in a recent study by Resources for the Future, and I just presented here to tee up the carbon dioxide savings question, which is that if over the past, since 2005, in the U.S., the carbon savings resulting from lower consumption, represented in blue on this graph, are almost as large as the carbon savings that come from things that we think about a lot more often, which is the use of low-cost natural gas in the U.S. and the addition of renewables through programmatic renewables policies. The efficiency savings are there building all the time, and we need to make sure that they continue in the future. Well, to make sure that they continue, we need stable and adequate funding. Jan mentioned the question of the supply chain. The energy efficiency supply chain consists of things you think about it: manufacturers, retailers, all kinds of delivery chain issues there, and installers, building improvement contractors, and so forth, all the way down to the customer. Those businesses require an environment to work in where the funding is going to be stable over a relatively long period of time in order to build up their capacity to deliver, and in order to create a marketing environment in which customers know that these savings are out there and they know how to go and get them. Numerous funding options have been invented, including, as we've already mentioned, the supplier obligation, distributor obligation, and I'm going to touch on capacity markets and carbon revenue in a minute, tax credits in some places have turned out to be a very important way to support efficiency, and France is a very major example of that. So I'm going to close with two examples that we touched on in our study. And the first is efficiency and demand response bidding in regional capacity markets in the U.S. And one of the nice things about this is that it has demonstrated the reality, efficiency and demand response research literally affecting total demand in the power sector in a very reliable way. And there's evidence to support that comes from the success of these markets. The chart here shows the growth of energy efficiency as a resource bidding in the capacity markets, ISO New England, which controls the power system in the 6 states of New England. And the growth of efficiency as a resource in that market is now come to a total of about 2,200 megawatts for delivery in the capacity year 2019 and 20. The lessons from this are that efficiency is a real resource. System operators, who are notoriously conservative people, have come to understand that it's a real resource. There are substantial consumer cost savings from allowing efficiency to bid against supply to supply future capacity needs. One example comes from the independent market monitoring in PJM, which is the largest wholesale competitive power market in the U.S., where in one auction alone, the decision to allow efficiency and demand response to bid lowered the clearing price so much that consumers saved $12 billion one auction period. The billions of dollars in customer savings have resulted from allowing efficiency to bid in these capacity markets. So that sounds wonderful. And some people say, well, if that works, why don't we just rely on capacity markets to deliver energy efficiency? We should not take that conclusion for two reasons. The first is that capacity markets by themselves are not necessarily the best way to ensure long-term reliability in the power system. Although we would say from this evidence that if any power systems are deciding to be in a capacity market, that they would do well to include efficiency and DR as part of the auction mechanism. But the capacity market by itself only rewards one aspect of the layer cake of benefits that we saw a few minutes ago. And we've seen in New England that it provides maybe only about 10% of the total cost of running the energy efficiency programs, which kind of makes sense since it's only one of the benefits being compensated. More importantly, the lesson from New England is that it's the existing energy efficiency obligations in the states, year after year after year, creating a resource that is reliable enough to be bid into the capacity. That creates the resource that we see on this chart. So it's going back to basics, the creation of an obligation that is stable, well-funded, and rising over the years that creates what you see on this chart. My last topic is to mention the importance of another funding source for energy efficiency, and that is carbon revenues. And here the example is also from the Northeast states, where the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, called RGGI, has for some years now governed the power sector emissions through a cap-and-trade program. RGGI has resulted in a 40% reduction in carbon in the power sector in the region. And the important point here is that the states created RGGI, when they created it, decided to commit a significant fraction of the auction revenues to reducing emissions by investing in efficiency. And over the years that RGGI's been in effect, even though the carbon price has been low in the U.S., just as it has been most years in Europe, more than $1 billion has been invested into energy efficient resources. And as a result, consumers have saved about $2.9 billion, according to the latest study, on their power bills over those years. And the result of this is that RGGI turns out to be a very politically popular program. Consumers are happy that the states are proceeding rapidly to lower carbon emissions, and at the same time they're reaping the benefits of lower energy bills and lower clearing prices in power markets. There are important lessons to be taken from this, that the idea of using carbon revenues to actually reduce carbon by investing in energy efficiency is an idea that could be taken up anywhere where jurisdictions are either moving to a cap and trade system or a carbon tax in order to lower emissions. And I think with that, we can close this presentation and take questions.